Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make simple rings using just 16 gauge wire and using the different metals and how they react differently. So that's about it, and we can get started and you can make your own little rings just like this. So now we're going to cut everything to length, and I'm going to show you how to figure this out and make it as simple as possible. So the first thing is you have to find your ring size. So when finding your size, you're going to want to just take one of these and put it on your finger and see which one fits your finger. It's pretty self-explanatory. And you don't want it to be too tight. So like this, that's too tight. And this catches, but doesn't just fall off. So we're going to go with this one. My thing says it's 17, but this is wrong. So to find the actual size, just take it and put it into a ring mandrel, and it'll line up with wherever your size is. So this is a 7.75. So to make this size, we need to take some measurements. You want to measure the metal first to figure out how thick it is. And this being 16 gauge, it's usually around 1.25 to 1.3. depending on where it is on the metal. We're going to say that these are all 1.25. The next thing we need is the measurement of the ring. And you can do this two different ways. You can either measure the mandrel, which would be 17.8 millimeters, or you can measure the inside of the actual ring. And when doing this, make sure to check multiple points and take the average from it. So as you can see, it's around that 17.8 millimeter. All right, so I'm going to show you how to do the math on this. So there's two ways to do it. There is the right way and the way that I do it to compensate for stretching. So I'm going to show you the right way first, which is the 17.8, and then you're going to divide it by 2. To get the radius of the ring. And then you're going to add the thickness to that, and then multiply it by 2. Then we're going to multiply that by 3.14, and we'll end up with 63.74, which will be exactly the right size. This doesn't compensate for if you stretch the ring at all. So if you stretch the ring, your sizing is going to be off and it'll be too loose. So what I do is I take the diameter and just add the thickness to it. Then I multiply that by 3.14, which gives us a smaller dimension, and it will make the ring a little bit tighter, but because we're hammering it and forming it, it will stretch to the right size. So I'm going to cut that size out of all three of the materials, and I'll show you different ways to do each one. So I'm going to set that on the digital calipers. Alright, so that is close enough, and if you are a little bit over, that is totally fine. Just because we're going to be taking a little bit of material off the ends to make sure everything's flat. And I'm going to show you how to use this miter block with the silver to make it as accurate as possible. So I'm just going to open it up and place it in here and line it up with this little square right here to make sure that it's squared in place, and then just have the tiniest bit of it sticking up, and then tighten this down, and you can see right here that our metal is sticking up just a little bit, so we're going to file that down. So when filing, you're going to want to use one of the bigger files and line it up and press and release, and basically you're only pressing. You don't want to scrub like this. Just go like that, because when you're scrubbing, it doesn't actually do anything. It's only this motion that's actually cutting. So now you can see that this is actually flat now. So the reason why we did this is when we're making our marks, if this has a cut or a slant or anything to it, it will skew how our measurements are here. So if we make it perfectly flat, then our measurements will be right on. So I'm going to take my calipers that are already set to the right size. I'm going to hook this onto here And then using the bottom, while still hooked on, I could scratch the metal. So I don't suggest doing that if you have an expensive set of calipers. These are sub $20 calipers, and they work perfectly fine for doing this, and I've been doing it for years, but you're not meant to actually mark stuff using these because it will wear down the ends over time. We are working with softer materials that are softer than the metal here, so it should take a very long time for that to happen, but just so you know, that's not the technical way you're supposed to do that. So you'll see we have that little mark right there. We're going to take this over to the bench pen and use a jeweler saw and cut straight through this. Alright, so at my bench pen, we're going to take our saw frame. I'm going to be using the German style one. I'm going to load its saw blade up with a little bit of the lubricant. So for the saw blade, I'm going to be using a 3/0, and if you don't know what the aught part is, it's basically a 3-0. So I'm just going to line this up on here. And as you can see, I've already cut a piece in here that makes it so I can easily cut different pieces of metal. I'm going to line that up and barely touch it and get a groove started. Once I have that groove, I can actually start pressing into it a little bit more and softly cutting through it, like that. So here's our piece, and I need to file down this edge over here that we just cut. And the reason for that is when we use a saw, you can get angles into it, and we need it to be as flat as possible for soldering. So here's another way to do it without using that block that I used before. The side of your bench pen is flat, usually. You can line it up with the flat edge until you can feel it scraping across your finger. Take a normal, larger file and line it up and file it down. Then you can scoot it a little bit more. That should flatten it out enough to solder everything in place. So I'm going to show you another way to do this with the copper. This one actually has been cut with a different type of cutter, so it leaves a mark here. So we have to at least take that down to get an accurate measurement. So I'm going to do this a very quick way using just the normal file and flatten this out. So now that we have that all flattened out, I'm just going to pull on here to make it as straight as possible. It doesn't need to be 100% perfect, but straight enough. And then same as before, I'm going to take my measurement and mark it by hooking it onto the front and scratching the back area. So as you can see, there's a little scratch right there. So to cut it this time, I'm going to use some clippers. So the mark is here. You can cut directly on the mark, and it should leave a decent cut there. But you have to make sure when you're cutting on the mark that this side is the side that you're keeping, and the other side is the stock still. The reason for that is, if you look at the actual stock now, it has a sharp point to it, and we would have to file all that down, and you'd also lose material, making your ring the wrong size. So with it cut like this, you just have to cut that down. I don't like doing this because it leaves those marks, and I like using the saw more. So I'm just going to use my hands to hold this and do the same technique again. I basically just line it up with my thumbnail. And there we go. It is smooth enough. And I'm just going to do the brass one pretty much the same way, just because there's no real difference between it. So here are all three of our different metals cut to the right size, and now in the next step we're going to play with our torches to anneal these. So I'm going to anneal these now, and the reason for that is it makes it a lot easier to bend them, because what annealing does is it softens the metals. So you can order different metals, and if you work with them a lot, they'll work hardened, or you'll get them and they're already hardened, and they're really hard and springy to move. Once you anneal them, they become very soft and pliable. So that's what we're going to do to make this as easy as possible. When annealing, you just use a torch and go over the piece until it starts to get red hot. And then you keep it at that red hot state without melting it for a couple seconds. And then you can put it into water, and then we'll go ahead and pickle them to remove any of the tarnishes or oxidation on them. And then we can start our next step. So for this, I'm going to be using the little butane torch. And if you don't know how to use one of these, or this particular one, you basically flip it to on, turn on the gas, and spark it. So I'm doing this on a charcoal block. If you do this just on a sheet of steel or some sort of big piece of steel, it won't work because the steel will absorb all of your heat. So what I'm doing is just going over them and warming them up evenly. And you'll see some color changing going on too. It does make it a little bit easier for a lot of people to turn the lights off so you can actually see when it starts to glow. And you don't want to do this too much to the point where they melt. You also want to be constantly moving when using your torch. If you stay in one spot, you will melt your piece. Alright, so that should be good enough. I'm going to take a pair of sharp tweezers and pick these up and drop them into a water bath. And once dropping them into water, they pretty much instantly become cool. So you can see that they are discolored now, and especially the copper, because copper oxidizes really quickly. And that's why it's a big problem when trying to make jewelry out of it, because it gets dirty so quick and it makes our soldering not work. So all of this is going into our pickle pot. So we're going to leave that in there for about 10 minutes or so. And if you're using brass, make sure you take it out within the 10 minutes or so and don't forget it in there, because it becomes extremely brittle because the acids in here start eating away the other metals and just leave behind the copper. Alright, so let's take these out. So here they are all cleaned up, and they're ready to be formed and soldered. Alright, so we're going to use the mandrel as a way of rounding them. It just makes it easier. Just take it and put it anywhere on here. I like to put my thumb over it to hold it and just kind of wrap it around. It'll make it into a little horseshoe or U shape. And I'm going to do that to all of them. So now that they're in a rounded shape like this, you can take some of your pliers and grab right here and slightly bend it like so. Try not to get a kink in here. If you get a kink in here, it's almost impossible to get out. So do the same thing to the other side. Just make sure that you have nice curves going. And then get them as lined up as possible. Kind of like that. Then I found that if you actually offset them and push them past one another and then pull back and bend up, you can get them to line up. Or you can even do that under one another and then pull back, and it should spring kind of together. This is a very finicky type of thing, but once you start getting more practice with it, it becomes easier. And all of these will use the same method. Alright, so here they all are. And I want to go over some soldering techniques, especially for these that make it extremely easy to solder these, and you don't have to worry about that much. So the number one question is, can I use this kind of solder for soldering jewelry together? And the answer is no. This is like 2% silver and very weak, very soft, and it's not meant for this. So don't use any type of electrical solder or even plumbing solders. You're going to want to actually order the proper solder for this, which is jewelry grade solder. So for this, we're going to be using a hard silver solder on all of these. Even though this is copper, brass, and silver, you use silver solder. they don't really make a copper solder that actually matches the copper. They do make a yellow solder that will pretty much match up with brass, but I don't have any because I don't use it very much. I use a lot more silver. So we're going to use silver solder for everything. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure they're on a charcoal block. Then I'm going to take them and lift them up and put a little bit of flux on the solder joint. You don't have to cover the entire thing. You only want that area to be clean anyways. So now that those have flux on them, I'm going to take some pieces of hard solder and just place them onto the block. So there are a couple ways that you can do this and a couple different ways people do this, but the best way that I have found, for me at least, is to take the piece after you put flux on it and place it directly on top of the solder. So the joint is sitting on top of the solder piece, and the reason for this is when you're heating this up, your flux will actually start to bubble if you don't dry it out first. And the heat can actually blow your stuff around too. If you have it set up like this, it's impossible for the solder piece to move. So if you set everything on top of it, the weight of the ring will make it so it's impossible for it to move out of place. And you might think, well, if I melt this, it's just going to melt down. Well, if you make all your gaps, like I showed you, when they're as tight as possible, the solder will actually kind of defy gravity and move up. Because how solder works is it moves to the hottest point. So that's another thing we're going to have to look out for when heating these. If you heat one side only, the solder is going to jump to that side and then spread out. And won't do anything on this side and won't bring everything together. So you have to heat evenly and then focus on one spot. So there we go. That is all done. So I'm going to take this, pick it up, throw it into our water, and move to the next ring. There we go. And here's a closer view of the silver one. So here are all three of them. And if you see any openings or anything like that, you need to clean them off and resolder them. But these all look fine, so I'm going to throw them into our pickling solution again. And here we go. So you'll notice that our brass one is turning kind of pink. And that's kind of what happens with brass when you heat it and put it into the acid. So this is normal, and I'll show you how to take that off. But we're going to shape these first. I'm going to start with the silver one. And this will also show you if you soldered them correctly, because if you're pushing it down on here and it pops open, you didn't solder it correctly. So I like to just push it down until I can't really push too much more. So this is where our mallet comes in. I'm just barely going to tap it. So you might be able to tell that this isn't straight on here anymore because we bent it. So I'm just going to take it off real quick before it's the full size that we need. And using the anvil part, I'm just going to go around it and flatten it out. And put it back onto our mandrel and make sure that it's actually round. So it should be the right size. There we go. Even with that little extra bit of solder on here that we need to take off, it fits my finger like it should. So we're going to do that same thing to the other ones. So here's our brass one, and this is actually perfect that it didn't work all the way. You can see right here that there's still a gap in it. And this happens every so often, it just doesn't flow right. You can see that I overheated one side, and the other side is not covered. So, because it's still kind of together like this, it's basically like tack welded in place, I can reflux this, reheat it, and this will flow back over there. So, I'll show you that real quick. So if you have this problem, that's how you can fix it. It's usually a lot worse than that. Usually you'll be putting it onto your mandrel and it'll pop apart. This one didn't, but it was really close to. So I'm just going to get this in the pickling solution to clean it up and then finish forming it. So here we go. Here's another one that's all done. It's a little bit bigger. That means it's stretched a little bit, but that's fine. If I check it on the finger that I made it for, it still fits. Alright, so these are all done, and they are rings, but they don't really look the best. And there's little bits of solder that kind of are off-putting. The next part, I'm going to clean all that up and show you how to polish them. So, for the silver one, it has a large piece right there. You can use a flat file and file it in the same shape as the wire, because you want to keep this curved motion going so you don't make a flat spot. So if you look on the inside, there's also a little bit that we need to clean up, and I'm going to be using a needle file. You want to do the same thing. You want to round the piece so you don't get flat spots. So there we go. That helps remove the solder real quick. So this is not the only way to do it. You can also use a rotary tool with a radial sanding disc like these and take it all off. For bigger spots where you can't really get to it, I'm going to switch back over to a file. So there we go. It's all cleaned up right there, and it's removed the majority of the solder. A little bit still right here, but that will be cleaned up in a little bit. Alright, so our brass one doesn't look too brass anymore, but we're going to fix that by cleaning it up with our rotary tool. Alright, so that takes off all of our pink look to it, which is actually just copper. So now it actually looks like a brass ring. So here are all three of our rings, showing off all of their different colors, but they're very matte. And some people actually like the matte look, but we're going to polish them up. Alright, so let's talk about polishing. This is a polishing wheel. You use a polishing compound with it. And to load this up, you have to spin it and touch it to the compound, and it will load up your polishing pad. You don't want to load it up too much, because it will just cake it onto your piece, and it doesn't really do anything. So one thing you need to know about polishing before any of this, it makes your piece extremely hot because it is friction. So let me go over it real quick and just show you how fast it'll change everything. So that's how fast you can polish something, but all the rest of it is still all white and matte. And as I was doing that little bit there, I could feel this getting hot. So there are little fingertip things that you can use so you don't burn your hands. I like these ones because they're little silicone fingertip things, and you literally just put them on your fingertips. So I only need to use 3 of them at a time because I'm going to be holding the piece. So I'm just going to hold it like this. And I'm going to load a little bit more on. And then you might notice that this is a lot bigger than the ring. So how do you get the inside? Well, you switch this out, because these come in all different sizes and shapes. This is actually a felt one too, so it's a different material also. You might also notice that it has a divot in the center, and that's because I use this one a lot for the inside of rings, and it wears that in. You can also use this on the outside if you really wanted to. So there we go for our silver one. The same process can be used on every single one of these. So these are all polished up now, but they are a little dirty from polishing them. So we're going to clean all this off. So one of the easy ways to clean these off is to use a soft toothbrush with soapy water. It's usually good to do this over a sink, but where my camera and stuff is set up, that won't work. So we get to use some red cups and paper towel. As you can see, this is all nice and dark from previous washings. And dry it off, and there we go. So our brass ring is all cleaned up and ready to go. So now I just need to do that to the other two, and they're going to be done. So there we go. All of them are all cleaned up and polished and ready to go. So now you can make stackable rings like this. You could add textures to these if you really wanted to. Just be very careful doing that, because it stretches the materials. So that's about it for these. They're pretty simple, and it's a good way to get into figuring out how to make rings and how to get them the right size and compensate for your stretching of smaller materials like these. So that's about it. If you found this video helpful, leave a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.